Can I start by saying a very warm word of thanks to the Police Superintendents Association and yourselves for inviting us today. We have what I think is a very important announcement to make. Some of you will have seen something of it in the newspapers this morning, but it's groundbreaking, and I think it is something that we're delighted to be able to do at this conference, not least because the Police Superintendents Association has for some years been in the van for arguing for a root and branch review of the future direction of policing, and that's exactly what we're proposing to do. I last attended this conference, I was trying to work it out, probably about 30 years ago, when I was in the Home Office working on policing then. And around that time, we received the report of the last major Royal Commission on policing, the Royal Commission on Criminal Procedure, which spawned pace and set the tone for prosecution and much else besides in the intervening years. I also remember from those distant days colleagues who had worked on the Willing Commission in 1961, 62, 63, the original Royal Commission on policing, which defined the structure of modern policing as well. And from that perspective, I stuck with the subject after doing a lot of other things in government, and have for some years been the chair of the trustees of the Police Foundation, because I do personally care strongly about the police service, its health and its effectiveness. I, like many others, have felt for some time that the changes in the challenges that the police are facing, the changes in society, the changes in technology in particular, make a very urgent case for having another root and branch review of what policing is for, what its direction is, what skills you need, what capabilities you need. And a review of that kind is long overdue. Ideally, one might argue it should be in the form of the Royal Commissions that I mentioned that took place in the past. But these days, there doesn't really seem to be much appetite within government for the Royal Commission model, which is why in the Police Foundation we have been pushing for some time and trying to raise the funds and the interest in a review of this kind. And from a personal point of view, I'm absolutely delighted that we're able to launch it today. I would also pay warm tribute to Paul Griffiths and his predecessors in your association, who have, as I said, consistently argued that we need something of this kind. I would think, wouldn't I, that the Police Foundation is the right organisation to be driving a review of this kind, partly because we are evidently independent and known for being so. We're politically impartial, politically neutral, and we strongly believe in evidence-based policy making and decision making. So we will be the host, if you like, for this review, but it will need to go a lot wider than the Foundation. Finally, I am particularly pleased that we managed to persuade Michael Barber to play the leading part in this. I worked with Michael when he was in government, leading the Prime Minister's delivery unit some years ago, and his common sense and analytical approach, his emphasis on outcomes and what actually works rather than the theory, is something that I've always admired. So I'm confident that with his leadership we can deliver something that will be important and worthwhile for the public and the political world. That's all I have to say. The main part of this will be a presentation from Rick of how we propose to do this, and then Michael himself, I think, wants to offer a few words, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to Paul Griffiths and to yourselves for giving us this opportunity to present to you today. As Bill said, we're announcing today the launch of the Strategic Review of Policing in England and Wales, and I'm going to talk a bit about the purpose of this review and how it's going to work before handing over to Michael Barber. So, in terms of the rationale, the first reason for undertaking a review, which will not be news to any of you here, is that demand on policing and expectations of policing have changed considerably in recent years. We know that crime is changing, in part because of technological change, which means that crime is increasingly complex and crosses geographical borders. We know that there have been changes in social attitudes, welcome changes in social attitudes that mean that crimes that were previously hidden, that happened behind closed doors and that weren't taken seriously by the criminal justice system, now are. And that puts that changes the nature of police work and increases demand on the police. We know that some types of crime, in particular serious violence, have been increasing in public in recent years, and indeed public concern about crime has been rising. Crime fell off the top 10 issues which the public said were the most important issues facing the country, as measured by Ipsos Mori. It's now back in the top 3. So this is an area of increasing public concern. And we know that non-crime demand on the police is also becoming more complex, linked to vulnerability, and as Sir Tom was talking about, requires a multi-agency response. So that's the first point. The challenge is changing, and we need to rethink the way things are done. We also know that austerity, combined with those changes in demand, have forced the police to make decisions about priorities. And indeed, through work that we've been doing, we find that sometimes the priorities that the police have led on have sometimes come into conflict with traditional public expectations of what policing should be focused on. There is a sense out there in the police service and among the public that the mission of policing has changed. And that may not be a bad thing, but I think it has changed without any real public discussion about what the role of the police should be. There's been no explicit change in the police mandate. It has simply responded to austerity and to changing demand in the way that the police service always does best, which is to do its best to respond to the most harm. But the time is right, we think, to have a real good look at what the police mandate and mission should be in the 21st century. The third reason for doing this now is that the last set of big policing reforms, which Sir Tom talked about in his speech, were a response, I think, to a different set of problems around local accountability, targets, the need to reduce the number of quangos, all of the issues around pay and so on, which Sir Tom led on. And we think a decade on from that big set of reforms, it's time to take a fresh look at the system and how it's currently working. We also think there is a concern out there, and you hear it from police colleagues a lot, which is that policing policy has lacked a long-term and strategic focus, that it's often been quite tactical, responding to immediate pressures rather than looking 10, 20 years ahead. And it's for all of those reasons that we think it's time for an independent strategic review, which is what we're launching today. So the purpose of the review is fourfold. First, to look at the challenges to public safety and indeed public well-being that the country will face in the 2020s and beyond. To think about what strategic response as a country we need to take to those challenges, because this is not just something for the police. If you're going to deal with cybercrime, online child sexual exploitation, dealing with the mental health issues, then as a country we need to decide how best to deal with those. So we need to look at what the strategic response to those challenges should be, and then thirdly, think about what the role of the police should be specifically in dealing with those challenges. And finally, looking at what changes may be required within policing in order to achieve this. So, some specific questions that we will look at, and you'll note as I talk through these, this is an ambitious agenda because we're touching on some of the biggest questions facing the police service. How has demand changed and what will future demand look like? What are the public's expectations of the police? What should the mission of policing be in the 21st century? What capabilities does the police service require if it's to deliver on that mission? What resources does the police service need and how should these be distributed? What should the future police workforce look like? How should policing be organised locally, regionally and nationally? And how should the police be held to account at those different levels? So we are looking at the really big policy questions facing the police service over the next number of decades. In terms of scope, the review is going to focus on England and Wales, although we will refer to evidence from Scotland and Northern Ireland. And indeed, we'll look at international evidence because we want to understand, where is the best policing going on around the world and what can we learn from international examples. The review will be strategic in that it will look at long-term challenges and it will aim to set a strategy that's designed to take policing into the 2030s and beyond. The review will consider all of the different elements required to keep the public safe and secure, and we recognise that many of those are not within the control of the police. And so while we'll focus on the role and capabilities of policing, we understand that policing alone cannot achieve the outcomes that we're talking about. In terms of how we will work, the review will be independent. It's independent of government, it's independent of the police service, it's politically impartial. We will be evidence-led, we'll be collaborative and public-facing, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. The review will be chaired by Sir Michael Barber, and Sir Bill Jeffrey will be the vice chair. The work programme will be delivered by my team at the Police Foundation. There will be an advisory board with representation from stakeholders across policing and beyond, and we'll be announcing the membership of that in the next few weeks. The funding for the review comes from charitable donations from the Doors Trust, a charitable trust, and Deloitte. This is not funded by any particular player in policing, and it's not funded by the government, and we think that's important because it means that we can take an independent view of the challenges. In terms of the timetable, we have 22 months in which to complete the review. We're starting now, and we hope to publish a final report in June 2021. We'll be very shortly issuing a call for evidence through October through to the end of the year, asking what the public, the different institutions and stakeholders within policing think ought to be done in answer to a set of questions that we will develop. So please do look out for that call for evidence because we'll be hoping to get substantial submissions from across policing. We're not just going to disappear into an office and write a big report. We will be publishing a number of interim papers throughout the course of the work. And indeed, there will be a programme of engagement events as well to accompany the work, so to invite contributions throughout policing and beyond. And it's really important to emphasise this point. This has to be an inclusive process. We are going to be talking to a lot of people. We're going to be talking to your colleagues. We are going to be we're speaking to the Superintendents Association and indeed the Police Federation about how we can make sure that police colleagues can feed into the review in a very active way. And so we'll be talking to the public as well through public engagement. So this will be a participatory and inclusive process, and I do encourage you to stay in contact with us. And I'll now hand over to Sir Michael Barber, who's going to be chairing the review.
Thank you, Rick and Bill, and thank you all for inviting me, and thanks to the Police Superintendents Association generally for the opportunity to be with you. I really welcome the opportunity to be here and hope that this event right now will be the start of a rich dialogue between yourselves and this independent review. I also, I'm very glad I was here to hear Sir Tom Windsor's introduction to the day. I read the annual report that he published a few weeks ago. I think we've got a powerful evidence base there already that the Inspectorate is building up and strengthening in the way that Tom described. Having said all that, I'm almost certainly the least informed person about policing in this room at this moment. And what I want to say is that my first aim in taking this through is to learn a lot from all of you, from other people around the country. I talked with Paul Griffiths last evening about the possibility of setting up some visits and maybe spending 2 or 3 days at some point in the next few months with the police force, just seeing at the front line the daily work that you and your colleagues around the country do. So I'm determined that the first goal, my first personal goal in this, is to learn and to learn with all the people involved in policing and rising to the challenges that we heard about from Tom and from Rick just now. Having said that, I want to go on and reinforce the points that Rick has just made about the review being impartial and independent. We need to bring, and I think that's a value I can bring coming from outside of policing, but with huge sympathy for the challenges and huge empathy for the work that you're doing. So we want to be impartial, we want, politically speaking, we want to be independent and bring an independent frame of mind to this. We want to bring a strategic frame of mind to it. So looking, as Rick was saying, into the 2030s and beyond, and really thinking about some of the fundamental questions. And I know this organisation, the Police Superintendents Association, has been calling for a fundamental review for a long period of time now, and talking to leaders of the police as we set up today's announcement, the word overdue kept coming up again and again and again. So we want to try and fulfil the ambition that lots of people around the police service have had for something that really does get fundamental, and I'll come to what that means in a moment. Also, of course, as all the work of the Police Foundation is, we want it to be evidence-informed, evidence-based, looking at evidence here, evidence around the country, evidence around the United Kingdom, including Scotland and Northern Ireland, and of course from around the world. The other thing I want to emphasise is I think there's a long tradition in Britain of policing attuned with the best of British values, and I think that's important. The respect for the rule of law, prevention, not just detection, policing and liberty going together, going right back. If you look at the debates which I did in preparation for this in 1828 and 1829 in Parliament, the sense that having an effective police force was essential to maintaining, as they saw it then, and developing British liberty and the liberty of individual citizens. And there's a kind of golden thread that runs through a lot of the stuff I've looked at of the relationship between police, individual police people, police forces, and the communities that they serve. And those are some values that are deeply embedded in the way police work in this country and the way communities relate to the police that seem very important to the future as they were to the past. So while we want to be fundamental, we don't want to lose the values that have made British policing so successful and so widely admired around the world over decades. When we talk about fundamental, Bill used the word root and branch. That's what we mean. If you go back, as I did to the 1828 debates when Peel proposed a committee to set up what became the 1829 legislation that established the Met, what he said was that the country has outgrown its police institutions. And what he was talking about was the rise of a huge growth in urban society. London especially he was focused on, but it was true in Manchester and Liverpool and Leeds and lots of other places as well. But he was also talking about the Industrial Revolution, the effect that had on society, and we were in a period, or Britain was in a period of massive transformation from a previously agricultural economy largely to an industrial one, and population growth was accelerating. Now, our circumstances are quite different from then, but what is quite clear is that there's a big transformation going on in the way our economy works, the way our society works, and policing, like every other social institution, has to respond to that, adapt to it, think strategically in relation to it. If you look at the 1962 Commission that Rick and Bill just referred to, they were responding to the post-war "you've never had it so good" years. And if you read the report, they had two major themes that they were responding to. One was some actually very minor, but nevertheless they'd got a lot of public attention, issues of corruption and so on. But the big one actually was traffic offences. The first motorway was opened in 1958 or something. People didn't know how to manage that. Now we look back on that and think, well, why couldn't you do that? But there are a lot of challenges facing us that are similar, big social and economic changes transforming our society as we speak, that policing and the law and the criminal justice system has to adapt to, prepare for, and look ahead. And as Tom said in his speech, we're going to try and look 10 to 20 years ahead. And Tom said anybody who predicts the future is going to get it wrong. It's how right, how close to being right can you be? How little wrong can you be? Can we try to get underneath some of the debates of the day to something that is really fundamental and looks 10, 15, 20 years ahead and helps build a police service fit for the future based on the values that I just described. You don't need me really to go through the challenges because you're familiar with them and you deal with them every day, but violent crime and the hidden crimes that are now becoming revealed with sexual offences, for example, cybercrime, online fraud that Tom referred to, cross-border crime where it's within 43 police forces, but it's global and international, even though you might be investigating in one particular place. These are big transformations. Then there's the public expectation to investigate historic crime going back 10, 20, 30, sometimes 40 years, as well as the day-to-day pressures of antisocial behaviour. So you're familiar with all of those things. And what I understood Paul Griffiths to be saying to the Times yesterday, quoted today, is all of those things are happening, and in the same time we've had 10 years of austerity. There's 20,000 fewer police forces now happily being addressed by the government. But the combination of that transformation and austerity means the gap between what the public expects and wants from you and your ability to deliver all of it is greater than it has been for a very long time. And we want to get to those fundamental questions so that we can establish a strategy for policing that will enable you to do what I know every police person would want, which is to meet the expectations as far as possible of the public to create a society that works, that's safe, that does prevention as well as detection and all the rest of it. So the idea would be that at the end of the review we had a path forward that would enable the police service in this country to be respected in communities and by the public across our country, but also maintain its reputation for being widely respected around the world. I spend a lot of time in my day job working in other countries, and I constantly hear very, very positive references to British policing as an example of how policing should be or could be, and countries aspire to that. So we need to maintain that long tradition of outstanding policing, build on it, and show what it would look like in the mid-21st century. I just want to finish by saying a few words about my own background. I was an education person for a long time. I worked in the Blair administration in Tony Blair's first term, implementing the school reforms. You might remember the literacy hour and the numeracy hour, and closing down some bad schools and intervening in some bad local education authorities. That was my role there. In the second Blair term, 2001 to 2005, I was in number 10, overlapped and worked closely with Bill on a number of things at that point, heading the Prime Minister's delivery unit, trying to make sure that the government delivered on its promises to reduce waiting times in the health service, reduce crime in a number of ways. You probably remember some of the targets you didn't like. That was my responsibility. But actually, you, not we, you did reduce crime very significantly in that period of time. There were many successes. And I had several very, very positive interactions with the police during that time, most intensely during the thing we called the Street Crime Initiative, which you may remember, where several big police forces, London and other big cities around the country, really got their focus on it working, and street crime was reduced dramatically within about a year or so and then maintained at a new lower level. And it was to me, it was an example of how when people get agreed on a priority and when then the government helps the police line up the rest of the criminal justice system, the school system, the health system behind the police, you can make progress in relatively short times on some of these big challenges. So it was always a great experience for me to work with police people, as with other public services. Now I chair the Office for Students, which oversees the university sector in this country, and rather in the way Tom was talking about regulators, we regulate the university sector. So I have a number of angles on the future of British society. I've really enjoyed all my interactions with the police in the past. I'm looking forward, in fact, one of the reasons I was keen to take this on when the Police Foundation asked me, I'm looking forward to being in dialogue with leaders of the police, with police superintendents and other ranks and officers around the country over the next year or two. And I hope we'll produce a report that you can be proud of, and more important, will help all of us get the police force in place to do the things it needs to do to make Britain a safe, secure, prosperous country where individual people can fulfil their ambitions at liberty. Thank you very much for your time and attention. We're going to take some questions now, and I haven't explained this to Rick, but the idea is that the questions can come to any of us, but the difficult ones will be answered by Rick and Bill.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, very, very much. We've got lots of questions already coming through on the app, which I'm delighted about, but I'm going to see if anybody wants to ask a question from the floor first off. If not, I will start the app questions. No, I don't think anybody. Right, I'm going to go to the most popular one first, which is, surely a review needs to be wider than just policing. Sir Tom said street violence can only be tackled with joint policy across all public services. How will this be achieved with the fragmented central structure? So is that broader picture something that you will be looking at?
Absolutely. So, in fact, one of the virtues of coming into this review, from my own point of view, from outside of the police service, but having deep roots in the education service and lots of connections with the health service, is that we can bring that together. And as I was saying about the street crime initiative, but it applies more generally, if we're going to think through the future of policing, we have to think through the future of the relationships between police and other public services. And I think Tom was talking about this earlier on. Police can't be the dumping ground for the problems that health or education can't sort out for themselves. So it's absolutely fundamental.
Wonderful. And I think this question is probably something a lot of people will have been thinking, which is, if the strategic review hasn't been commissioned, obviously has benefits. You can be as independent, completely squeaky clean independent, but without being commissioned by government, to what degree will government actually be mandated to take any note at all of all the hard work you've done and your recommendations?
I think mandated is too strong a word, but I've been very encouraged by the fact that the response from government so far has been positive. I think inside government, certainly among officials and possibly among politicians as well, there is a view that something like this is needed, and there's the hope they can get something useful out of it. My ambition for the review is that at the end we should produce a set of ideas, recommendations, findings, call it what you will, which collectively amount to a way forward and are influential. I think if we could influence and help to structure the debate within the service itself, and the politicians in the main political parties, and the people who are working on these matters within government, then there's some chance that through this review we can create a consensus that a future government acts on.
And I suppose by June 2021, we'll all be hoping the Brexit nightmare will be behind us, but maybe that's wishful thinking.
Well, I think in a way it's a good time for us to start this process, because in a way, as we know, politics is quite distracted by other events. And so, we're going to get on with our work, we're going to look ahead, and hopefully by the time politics has sort of settled down somewhat, people will turn their attention to sort of domestic policy matters, and our review will be primed to do that. And you'll see, if you look at the our website, and you'll see the details of the website you can go to up on the slide. We have support and endorsements there from all the major stakeholders in policing, including from yourselves at the Superintendents Association, from the Federation, from the National Police Chiefs Council, from Lynn Owens at the National Crime Agency, from Sir Tom at the HMIC FRS, from the Cabinet Secretary, Mark Sedwill, and indeed the Home Office have responded positively with a press statement today as well. So we think we've assembled a coalition of organisations, all of the major organisations in policing, who really want this to happen. I think that's quite a powerful group of people who really want this to happen, and and that will give it some impact.
It's Michael.
I just want to reinforce the message of my colleagues here, and just make one detailed comment. Mark Sedwill, the Cabinet Secretary, and you'll be familiar with him from his background in Home Office and security, but it's very rare for a Cabinet Secretary to make a public statement in support of some independent review being established. And that, to me, illustrates the enthusiasm of the senior civil servants, not just in the Home Office, but across the piece, for this kind of work. And that, when we report finally in 2021, who knows what government will have by then. But it's very, very important that we have senior civil servants as well as senior police people supporting this review.
And can I ask about sorry, carry on.
I'll answer on answer, but I think also that what Michael's just said goes to the first question. The fact that the Cabinet Secretary is interested in this means that at a government level, from my experience, it shouldn't be difficult to play in these major issues about the relationships with other services, because the problems that you have with the other services, and as Tom was saying, they often go back to deep long-term underfunding as well, are reflected within government in coordination among the departments responsible for these services. So the fact that this review has caught some attention at the centre of government is potentially very powerful.
And can I ask a bit more about the structure of the project? So there's an advisory board. Have you announced who's on the advisory board?
Not yet, no. We're putting that together at the moment, and the idea is to have as you say, Sir Michael and Sir Bill will be the chair and the vice chair. We'll have an advisory board which will help steer the review, which will have representation from across different parts of policing and beyond policing, academia, politics, cross-party representation. And so
there will be former politicians or some people with political bents.
And we will announce that within the coming weeks.
Because Danny Shaw seemed to be hinting on his Twitter feed this morning there were very interesting people on the advisory board. I wanted you to tell me who they were.
Well, we're not going to announce that today, but we will be announcing that shortly, so watch this space.
Damn it. Right. What will be done to ensure, this question says, the public are informed in terms of the full range of police responsibilities? How will their expectations of the police service be sought?
The public?
The public, yes. So this is about, I guess, both Sir Tom and yourselves, we're talking about the public expectations of what the police can possibly achieve, and the realities are getting further and further apart.
Yeah, I mean, we've already been conducting some work on public expectations. We've been doing a lot of focus groups around the country with members of the public. So we've already gathered together a lot of evidence, and we'll be publishing that as one of our first sort of outputs in the autumn. And we'll do further such work as we go along. So we need to understand what it is that the public wants. The early findings from that work is that actually the public are quite clear about what they expect of the police. It doesn't really vary from place to place. The public have very consistent views about what they expect from the police service, and it won't be of a surprise to anyone in this room. People have quite a traditional view of what the police do, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I mean that's a positive thing. They understand. They have an understanding of what they think the police are for. There are some issues like the mental health issues that we talked about. The public are quite surprised that the police spend so much time dealing with those. They as Sir Tom said, they don't not want it to be dealt with, and they realise if someone's in distress or may be causing harm, that the police will need to be involved. But they're asking questions about why it is that so much of that is landing at the door of the police service, and then they're asking questions about, well, why isn't the health service dealing with it? Why aren't social services dealing with it? What are the issues in housing and so on? One of the positive things I think is coming out of the public engagement work we're already doing is there is actually some real clarity around the priorities that the public have for the police.
Lovely. This is an interesting one about lessons or other reviews that you may have studied, either for bad practice or good practice. This question says, are there lessons your strategic review of policing can glean from the strategic defence reviews and their success in attracting increased funding using hard evidence? Is that a model you're keen on?
Well, as the former Permanent Secretary of the Minister of Defence, I ought to apply to that. I'm not sure how successful we ever were in getting funding through defence reviews, but what I did take away from the experience of being involved in defence for 5 years is the sense that looking strategically, first of all, at what the challenges are going to be, and then very carefully analysing what capabilities you need to meet these challenges in a rather deliberate way is potentially a good way to approach the matter. And it's not something I think, when I worked in both the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence, and I don't think with the police we have ever been quite as systematic in thinking, what are the future challenges? What sort of specific capabilities do you need to meet these challenges? And then how do we assemble these capabilities? So I personally can see advantage in bringing a little bit of that methodology into the picture. But it's not necessarily a means of getting funds. I think, as we've seen in the last few months, the best way to get funds is through politics, because essentially, in the end, these are political decisions.
So, Michael, I know you wanted to come in on it. We're just getting a microphone to the back, but so, Michael, you...
Yeah, I just wanted to, another role which I didn't mention before that I've been playing in the last year or two is working with the Treasury on how you measure the value you get from public expenditure. So Britain spends somewhere between 800 billion and 900 billion pounds a year on everything: defence, policing, schools, hospitals, everything. How do you know whether you're getting, the citizen is getting value, or we the taxpayers are getting value for the money that we hand over to the government? All government money is other people's money. It's our money. Is it getting value? And we're looking at answering 4 questions about that, and you can see how this applies into policing. The first is, when money is allocated in a spending review, we just had a very short-term spending review last week, but there'll be a longer-term one looking 3 years ahead, probably next year. So the first question is, what are the main goals that money is decided? When we give money to police, what are we expecting them to do with that money via the Home Office? So there's a set of questions about medium-term goals. Then there's a set of questions about how the money is being spent. Is it being allocated to the things it was allocated for? Is it flowing through the system in a fair and transparent way? Is it then being used for the purposes it was allocated? So that's the second pillar. And then the third pillar is, to what extent are in this case, in your case, the Home Office as the government department, but also yourselves as police people, engaging the public in helping building a dialogue so they understand why the money is being spent in the way that it's being spent, and the way in which they can contribute to achieving the outcomes by, if you take schools as a classic, if children do more homework supported by their parents, their standards will rise without the teachers having to do anything different. If you want to reduce health problems and public health, you need people to change their diet, do more exercise, and so on. So engaging the users of a service and the citizens so that they understand what it's doing is the third pillar, and how do we know whether that's happening? And then the fourth pillar is, are we building institutions for the future? This has been neglected in public expenditure management over the last 20, 30 years. So when you spend money, are you not just delivering some goals for the next 4 or 5 years, but are you building a police force that has the skills, the recruitment capacity, the technology, all the rest of it, that will keep it being strong 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead? And those are 4 pillars of public value. And that's becoming part of the way the Treasury is now thinking about public expenditure. I think it's a big opportunity for the police when the next spending review comes round to look at those 4 headings.
Lovely. Now I've got 2 questions. A gentleman at the back and a gentleman at the front. I'm going to take the questions immediately one after each other and then give you a chance to sort of wrap up because we've got 5 minutes left. Sir.
Chris Smith from Police Oracle. It's fortuitous because I want to ask about the funding. So we've got things like the police precept, you've got situations where the Home Office is saying there's an initiative that you can bid for. They're all short term. If you're going to look at 10, 20 years ahead, surely a factor in all of this has got to be ending bidding pots and those kind of scenarios. If you want long-term thinking, you've got to have long-term funding and ending short-term thinking within central government.
All right, sir.
Hello, Simon Ovens from the Met. Such is the pace of change these days that I think many big businesses are largely giving up strategic planning, looking so far ahead, and just reacting to what is happening now. That can certainly be read across into policing. Given in what you have said about your wish to look at 5, 10, 20 years ahead, when we have no idea what life is going to be like then, wouldn't your combined efforts be better spent on trying to sort out the issues and the mess and maybe, as Sir Tom said, the crisis we have now and what that might look like in 1 year, 2 years, rather than spending your effort on what life might be like in 20 years' time?
And on that theme of perhaps saving some energy that might be wasted, I'm going to throw in a question from the app as well, which says, should the work mentioned by Sir Tom around the development of a single system be paused to take account of your review to save the duplication of resource and effort we so often see? So a slight echo there of perhaps taking on too many different reviews?
Yeah, no, I mean, on the point about reviews, there's a number of things going on, and of course the Chancellor announced a strategic review of a government review of serious and organised crime in the spending review, and of course we've already spoken to the National Crime Agency about linking up with that review, yeah, we will need to be, I don't think the whole world should stop while they wait for this review, but people should continue doing the work that they're doing, but we will be in communication with all the other work which is progressing. It is important to look the next 5 years ahead, and we will do that. I mean, we will look at the immediate pressures and at the medium term as well. And clearly, there's a lot of things you can't predict. I mean, you only have to look at what's going on politically to think who would have predicted any of this, even 5 years ago. But there are some things you can predict. There are some things you can look at in terms of the way technology is changing crime, the way in which society is aging, becoming more diverse, and so on. These are things which are very likely to continue, and we need to consider the impact of climate change. I mean, not everything is predictable, but there are some things, some long-term structural forces which we can identify, which have implications for policing. So I guess the answer to the question is we will try to do both, and not sacrifice looking at the near term. On funding, we will look at funding, and there are clearly huge questions about not just the quantum of funding, but the way in which it's distributed. Things like the Police Transformation Fund, the funding formula between forces. We will want to look at all of that. I say that thinking, crikey, that's going to be a lot of fun trying to disentangle the funding formula. But these things need to be looked at because the current system has been around for a long time, and there's been repeated political failure in trying to address it and change it. So yes, we do want to look at that, and we will want to look at things like the Transformation Fund as well, where one of the issues with it is I think the short-term nature of the funding that's available, and so you get big streams of really critical bits of work which don't know whether they're going to have funding in 6 months' time. All of that I think we will look at and need to address.
I'm going to squeeze in one last quickie, which I've got less than 90 seconds, fewer than 90 seconds. Dame Carol Black is writing a paper on how to tackle county lines, which she acknowledges will require cooperation from all public services. How will the various reports' findings be captured and considered in the review, and how will that cooperation be achieved? We'll absolutely look at the work that the Carol Black Review is undertaking, and obviously, as we've said, one of the key things here is we are going to be looking at some of these areas of crime which are increasingly cross-border, not just international, but crossing force borders. County lines, of course, is a key one of those, and a key area where a multi-agency response will be required. And so, yeah, absolutely, we will look very closely at that piece of work. Final thought from Sir Michael.
Yeah, I want to comment on the previous question, actually, which I think the funding point is well taken, and I understand the scepticism about bidding pots. If you've got the fundamental funding system sorted out, and bidding pots shouldn't be part of that, in my view, using competitions to go beyond the basics of funding to get innovation, I think, is worth thinking about. So, and I'm not talking about policing here. I've seen this work very well in education and health systems. But you have to get the basics of the funding system sorted out and look long term. And that actually raises Simon's point. I totally agree there's a need to look at 1 or 2 years, which I think was the timetable you described. But we mustn't get into a false dichotomy. It's not choosing between short term and long term. We have to do both. And it's getting that combination right. If you just want to make a remote comparison, so go back to Joseph in ancient Egypt. Okay? The Pharaoh has a dream. 7 fat cows, 7 thin cows. But nobody in the Pharaoh's court knows what it means. And then one of them says, "Well, Pharaoh, there's this guy in prison who's really good at dreams." They bring him, they throw him in front of the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, "What does it mean?" He says, "I know exactly what that means. You're going to have 7 years of plenty, and then you're going to have 7 years of famine." And then he could have stopped there, but he doesn't. He says, "You've got to save the corn for the first 7 years." Now, if somebody had said to him, just do the first 2 years and then forget about it, they wouldn't have been able to feed the people of Egypt when the second lot of 7 years of famine came.
But
we
have
a name for that kind of dream in modern Britain. We call it a treasury forecast.
Yes.
We have to think 15 years ahead.
But you beat me to it because, I mean, as somebody who's been around politics even longer than me, and I've been around politics quarter of a century, the short-termism around Westminster, because of the parliamentary system, because anybody's only ever thinking about the next election, which is always less than 5 years away, that's why we're in the pensions crisis. That's why they haven't taken note of the ageing demographic, because of the parliamentary system. So any proper long-term planning, not for all politicians, but for many politicians, goes out of the window.
Exactly, and that's why it's important that the Police Foundation does this impartial and independent of party politics.
Well, on that note, on which we all agree, I think I am now 2 minutes over time, so thank you for all your questions. They were wonderful. As I let our panel leave the stage, would you applause them off the stage, please, ladies and gentlemen?